Welcome to this debate for candidates for the 114th Pennsylvania House of Representatives, sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County and Toyota of Scranton. The mission of the League of Women Voters is to promote participation by informed citizens in their government. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, which means we do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. My name is Diana Dakey, currently president of the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County. The League of Women Voters is an organization of men and women of voting age. I encourage our viewers to join the League, which you can do on our website, lwvlackawanna.org. Membership connects you with 3 levels of the League: county, state, and national. Please be aware that it is our policy that no person, candidate, or political group is allowed to excerpt or edit today's debate recording. Campaigns may post a link to the debate where voters may view it in its entirety. Andrea Malloy will serve as moderator for today's debate. Andrea is presently on the board of the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County and is a past president. Our moderator, Andrea Malloy, will introduce the candidates in alphabetical order.
Thank you, Diana. And welcome to this, the very first virtual debate that the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County has ever hosted. And welcome to our candidates as well. I would like to thank our partners, as always, the University of Scranton's Political Science Department, also ECTV, which will broadcast our debate, and this year, Toyota of Scranton for their generous support of the work that we do and helping us to cover costs for promoting this virtual debate. So we thank our partners. Just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. We've asked the candidates to turn off their mobile devices. This will run approximately 60 minutes, give or take a little bit more. All candidates will answer the same set of questions, and no questions were given in advance. Each candidate will be allowed up to 2 rebuttals of 1 minute each, and they can use the full 2-minute time allotment at one time if desired. And I will also say that for the purposes of the Zoom recording, when someone is not speaking, they will be muted. And the reason for that simply has to do with the technology in Zoom. So with that, let's get started today. So Bridget Kosierowski. Bridget, good morning and welcome.
Thank you.
Bridget is a resident of Waverly Township. She and her husband Joseph are the parents of Jake, Maggie, Anna, and Noah. She's a graduate of Scranton Prep and received a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Villanova University. She currently serves as the Pennsylvania State Representative to the 114th Legislative District, and she was elected in a special election in March of 2019 to fulfill the seat that became open with the passing of Sid Michael Kavulich. Bridget is a registered nurse, previously working at Mercy Hospital and most recently at Northeast Surgery Center in Dixon City. Her civic involvements include serving as an auxiliary board member at St. Joseph's Center, a member of the Lackawanna County American Cancer Society, and a board member of Coaches versus Cancer. So again, welcome, Bridget. And Bridget is the Democratic candidate. The Republican candidate is James May. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Is a resident of Ransom Township. He and his wife, Jill, are the parents of James, Isaiah, and Hannah. He graduated from Summit Christian Academy in Clark Summit and received a Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education from Clark Summit University, a Master of Divinity from Baptist Bible Seminary in Clark Summit, and a postgraduate certificate in Middle Eastern Studies from Jerusalem University College. James was formerly the regional press director for PennDOT in Northeastern Pennsylvania and is currently a real estate investor. James served in the U.S. Army as chaplain, reaching the rank of captain. He is an Iraq war veteran. And James, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
6 years ago, James and his wife, Jill, started an organization called Northeastern Pennsylvania Student Ministries to take high school students from Northeastern Pennsylvania on mission trips to Central and South America, where they work with orphaned and at-risk children, many of whom are victims of human trafficking. And they are also active members of Grace Bible Church. So good morning and welcome. There will be no opening statements, so we will get directly to the first question. And we did pull straws for this, and I'm going to actually mute James at this point. And so Bridget will be the first person who can speak. So Bridget, this question goes to you first, and we're going to start something that is on all of our minds right now, and that is voting by mail. And again, you will have a 2-minute response time. Act 77 of 2019 made it possible for the first time for all Pennsylvanians to vote by mail. Following the June 2020 primary, Act 35 instructed the Pennsylvania Department of State to provide a report on lessons learned from the primary to ensure a safe, secure, accessible general election this November. The report stated that to ensure the accurate count of the ballots, the Pennsylvania General Assembly must allow counties to begin pre-canvassing ballots in the weeks before Election Day. The League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania has urged that legislation be passed to provide for a 7-day pre-canvass window that prohibits producing results before election. The question to you, do you support legislation to allow pre-canvassing for this and for all future primary and general elections? And please explain your answer.
Good morning, and I wanted to say thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting this debate, and welcome to anyone who is watching via Zoom. It's our job to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for people to perform their civil right. We should never be in a state of mind where we're trying to limit someone's access to the ballot box. We should never be removing drop boxes or limiting the time to send in your ballot, decreasing that amount of time decreasing that time registered to vote. I support no excuse absent ballotees, but I also support pre-canvassing, early voting, same-day registration, automatic registration, and making Election Day, we should make it a national holiday. I also believe in allowing registered independents to come and vote in the primary election as well, because the more we have participating in a democracy, the better. So I would absolutely support any kind of election reform that would make that possible.
Okay, thank you. James, you should get a message asking you to unmute. So you want to click on that. There we go. Okay. So
will I need to unmute every time it comes back to me then?
Right, you will need to unmute.
Okay. Well, let me begin by thanking the League of Women Voters for doing this. These are always great events that you do, and thank you so much. I will also need to begin just by saying 13 months ago, my wife and I became grandparents, and last night was the sleepover night with our grandson. And so if you see me drifting off sort of in the middle of this whole thing, no offense taken. It was a long night last night with our 13-month-old grandson. So just let you know that right up front. I have had the privilege of serving in Iraq. I know you said that in the introduction as a chaplain, and I have seen firsthand men and women who have been willing to risk their lives in order to go vote. In Iraq, we work with a number of the people over there who were literally risking their own lives to go and to vote. I have also served alongside of men and women, soldiers, who have put their life at risk in order for us to vote. And so the integrity of the vote and the integrity of making sure that every vote is counted is absolutely critical. So anything that we can do to make sure that the votes are counted. Obviously, I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned after this upcoming general election, just because so many people are doing the mail-in ballots. I think when we first looked at doing the mail-in ballots, they never envisioned that we would be in this type of scenario, even like we're doing with this Zoom. There are so many things that we need to work through, so many glitches probably that we will have. But as a general rule, I like the idea of making ballot access easier for people. I like the idea of having the 5-day window. Obviously, this year, especially with all of the mail-in ballots that will be coming in, it's going to be very important that we take the time to get all of those counted. And I would rather have us start counting on the front end rather than the back end, in order to make sure that we can have a good count by election day. Obviously, Pennsylvania is such a critical swing state. So I do support that. I do want us to be very, very careful, though, in everything that we're doing, whether it's the drop boxes, whether it's the mail-in ballots, whether it's the registration online, that whatever we are doing, that we are protecting the integrity of the vote. And so that's going to be very critical as well.
Okay, thank you. James, this second question is going to go to you first. And we touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to ask for a more in-depth answer. And this is on the primary election. Many people in Pennsylvania and across the United States feel that primaries are not working to engage the most voters and determine the best candidates to advance to the general election. Pennsylvania is one of only 9 states with a closed primary system, which only allows registered Republican and Democratic voters to choose candidates. Voter turnout in primaries is low, and the closed primary system is confusing for other registered voters when there is a question on the ballot that needs to be voted on. Recently, a bill to allow non-party affiliated voters to vote in primaries passed in the Senate with broad bipartisan support, only to languish in the House State Government Committee. So the question to you is, what changes to Pennsylvania's primary system will you support? And please explain why you choose that.
Well, I will tell you straight up, and this probably isn't the politically correct answer to give, but I don't support open primaries when it comes to letting Democrats vote in Republican primaries, Republicans vote in Democrat primaries. 2 reasons. One, I think that there's the possibility of either party coming in and voting in a way that in order to ensure that they get the weakest candidate. And so, for example, you would have a situation where there would be a contested, say, Democrat primary, and the Republicans may all come in and just say, well, let's vote for this one individual because we think that they're the weaker of the candidates. Essentially, what a primary is each party gets together and they are choosing who they want to be their nominee. And in the same way that I would not go into a local fire company where I was not a member and try to vote on who the president of the fire company would be, or if a union, if I'm not a member, to vote on who the president of that union would be. The purpose of a primary is for each party to choose who they want to be the representative for their party. So I actually support the idea of keeping primaries closed. Now, what I do think we need to really look at is making ballot access easier for third-party nominees. And right now, when you look at what it takes for like Bridget and me to get on the ballot, you need 300 signatures. When you look at what is required for third-party and independent candidates to even get on the ballot, I think that's where we need to really put our focus. And I would support anything that we can do to make it easier for third parties, because having more people on the ballot, I think, is good for democracy. But I don't want to do that simply by opening up and getting rid of the closed primary.
Okay, thank you. Bridget, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and James, I'm going to mute you. And Bridget, the question goes to you. What changes to Pennsylvania's primary system will you support? And please explain your answer.
So any changes to the primary, I do believe in open primaries, and I do believe that independents should be able to vote in a primary election. Just like the belief that more people, the better, to participate in democracy. So I do believe in an open primary, and I think it's best for, like I said, the democracy and people that would be able to be involved.
Okay. So Bridget, this next question will then go to you first. And this one, again, sticking with the things that are on everybody's mind right now, the pandemic. So we have seen months of ever increasing numbers of infected persons and deaths due to COVID-19. In Pennsylvania, as in other states, we have seen tensions and legal wrangling between the legislature and the executive branch concerning the need for protocols of quarantining and social distancing versus the need to carry out basic functions of the economy. The question to you, in this pandemic, how do you see the role of the legislature in determining the proper balance between medical safety and the economy?
Well, first and foremost, I believe we had to, protect and save lives. And COVID-19 was a novice virus, novel virus, and nobody was prepared for it. There was no playbook to go off of. Science was not even prepared for it. And things were changing literally by the second. We didn't know if this thing was airborne, how long does it live on a surface, how does it spread, you know, who is most susceptible, what symptoms present at first, how long and how do we isolate? And we had to educate everybody on how this virus mitigated, and that data also is changing daily. We know a couple things. We know that 216,000 people have lost their lives to this virus, and 8,000 of them being Pennsylvanians. The fact that Pennsylvania at one point we were the 3rd most infected state in the country, we've gone to the 12th in a few short months does say something about our mitigation process. There's a reason why PA reopened when they did, and it was able to be one of the states that actually remained open, and we didn't have to shut down again. But that did not come with a tremendous amount of sacrifice. Our small businesses and essential workers truly took the brunt of the sacrifice. And as a nurse and as a mother of 4, when we see a problem, we immediately look for solutions and not blame. And this is a situation where anybody can go back and play Monday morning quarterback. And I'm just not about to do that. So the focus now needs to be on what's the solution. And the solution is how do we help them recover? We've got $1 billion in federal aid just sitting at the state. And we need to allocate that money immediately to our small businesses and our schools. We need to make sure our businesses and our workers have the proper resources they need to get, back on their feet, but also, remain standing. And that's where my focus is.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to mute Bridget, and I'm going to ask James to unmute. So James, you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, all right.
The
Yep.
question goes to you. And how do you see the role of the legislature in determining the proper balance?
Okay, so the question is the role of the legislature, not so much the big picture issue of COVID right now. One of the major votes that I think was cast wrong in Harrisburg, where I differ with Bridget, is everybody understands that there needs to be the ability for the governor to come in an emergency declaration, an emergency situation, and have certain powers that he would not normally have under any other circumstance. It's when there's a pandemic, when there's any kind of major issue that happens, an emergency that happens, the governor does need to have the ability in a short-term process to be able to make decisions and do things that he could not normally do. That's why he has the emergency declaration power, and that's why they have granted that to him. I do not believe it was ever the intent of that power to be given to the governor for 9 months. The idea of that is for him to be able to deal with a short-term situation, to come in and to deal with that, whether it's a major flood, a natural disaster, an attack on our state. He has to have the ability in the short term to handle in a quick response a situation that comes in. What we have seen now, we're 9 months into this thing. There is no way, specific to your question, there is no way that the founding fathers, and when they put that power in there, intended for a governor to have the amount of power that he has had now for the last 9 months. I strongly disagree that 9 months into this, that he is able to do what he's able to do without consulting the legislature. I support an amendment to the Constitution. I supported a bill that was introduced that says that the governor's powers under these circumstances are limited. The legislation is 21 days. I even think that's probably a little bit too long, but okay, we're going to give him a little bit of time. But after that, I think it's an absolute abuse of power for him not to consult with the legislature.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, James, will go to, Bridget wants, okay, I'm sorry. Let me unmute Bridget. And I'm going to mute James. There we go, okay. Bridget? Nope, you're still muted.
Better?
Now you're good. So you
Okay.
have 1 minute for your rebuttal, or 2 if you choose.
Okay, I think Mr. May is referring to this House resolution. It was called House Resolution 836, which would prematurely terminate the disaster emergency order. And I need people to understand something about House Resolution 836, what it actually does and does not do. First, the governor's emergency order and the Secretary of Health's business closure were two totally different things. Not only would the premature termination of the emergency order have set us back all the progress we had made in combating the spread of this disease, but it would put us in a poor position to address the resurgence of a public health threat. But it also leaves those who sacrificed so much during this crisis in a deeper financial hole. The federal government can end the disaster declaration period as soon as the Commonwealth terminates the disaster emergency. The Commonwealth would have risked losing all the federal reimbursement of all costs associated with this response to the COVID-19. The state agencies, we've got county and local government, school districts, authorities, certain private nonprofits like volunteer fire companies, hospitals, and nursing homes. So I think when you think about it, you have to think common sense. The federal government cannot give emergency state funding to a state that is not in a state of emergency. And there's a reason why states like Alabama and Oklahoma, like every other state in the country, did not have that terminate their declaration of emergency. And we really shouldn't have either.
Okay. James, do you have anything that you want to add to that, or should we move on? And you're still, there we go.
I won't use up my rebuttal at this point. I'll probably touch on it later, but I just don't want to use up my rebuttal this early.
Okay. So we're going to move on, and this question pertains to women's health. With the expected confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court, efforts to overturn Roe v. Wade may result in the loss of a national guarantee for women's access to pregnancy termination, or perhaps even birth control, to be replaced by laws enacted by individual states. If Pennsylvania had to enact its own laws on this matter, what would you support?
Is this with me first?
Yes, you're first.
Okay, all right. Terminology is so interesting in this. I find it interesting you'd refer to it as women's health, not health of the unborn. I am pro-life. Yesterday was the 2-year, as we're recording this, I'm not sure when it'll be played, but as we're recording this, it's October 17th. And yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of the passing of Representative Kosierowski. And I appreciated Bridget putting some comments up as well. And I think both of us, that's one of the things we're going to certainly be in agreement with, that he was such a good representative for our area. He was passionate about the protecting of innocent human life. I am pro-life, and you know, I'm not going to make any apologies for that. I have been endorsed by the Pennsylvania Pro-Life Federation. This is the first time in their history, their 41-year history, that they're endorsing the challenger over an incumbent, because throughout our the time here that we've had representation here, going all the way back to Frank Serafini days, you know, back in the early 90s, through Jim Wanzak, Sid Kosierowski, the representatives here in the area have always been pro-life, Democrat and Republican. So I am pro-life. And so obviously we don't know what specific legislation would be coming up, but anything that we could do to protect the innocent human life, I would support that legislation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to mute James, and Bridget, I'll ask you to unmute. And the question again is, if Pennsylvania had to enact its own laws on this matter, what will you support?
So this is a topic that is being billed as a black and white issues, and there's a lot of gray. You know, unfortunately, the state legislator is creating bills that are trying to make a lot of these gray issues into black and white issues. And as a legislator, my job is to be looking at each of these bills on its own and making the best decision for the people I represent. And that may upset one side one day and make another side happy the next. I want to make something really clear. I'm a pro-life candidate with exceptions to rape, incest, and the life of a mother. And those exceptions must be legal in Pennsylvania. I'm a registered nurse. I've been doing this for 27 years. I spent my entire life working to protect, respect, and take care of people from the beginning of life to the end in hospice. And when it comes to protecting life, and decreasing abortions, we have to make sure we are making sure we have proper funding for education, access to contraception, access to affordable health care, making sure that during a global pandemic, men, women, and children are not losing their health care. We need to make sure that we are protecting the lives of children in poverty and providing them with the tools they need as well as their families need to survive. No one wants to see abortions increase. So we have to look at some policies that will decrease them. And according to the CDC, abortions were down 30% in the 90s under Democratic policies, 30% in 2009 to 2016 under Democratic policies, and it was only down 4% under the Reagan administration and 3% under the Bush administration. So it's clear here with these statistics, with the policies, which policies would help decrease abortion.
Okay, thank you. Bridget, this next question goes to you first. And sticking with the healthcare issues, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. The constitutionality of the National Affordable Care Act is again being reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court. If the court finds the ACA unconstitutional, tens of thousands of Pennsylvanians could potentially lose their health insurance for a variety of reasons. If this happens, which of the following ACA provisions would you advocate be protected by state laws? So I'm going to ask three things, and I'm going to ask you to just give a yes or no first. And after I go through the three things, then you'll have 2 minutes to answer the question. Okay? So the things are, would you support continuation of the extended eligibility for Medicaid, which provided health coverage to many Pennsylvanians? So that's a yes or no.
Yes.
Would you support the continuation of children being eligible to remain on their parents' health insurance until the age of 26? Yes or no?
Yes.
And would you support the continuation of the ban on denying health care based on pre-existing conditions? Yes or no?
A ban, no.
Would you support the continuation of the ban?
No, I would not support a continuation of a ban for access for pre-existing condition.
Now, I think it's just a matter of the language. What we're asking is, would you support the protection for pre-existing conditions?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sorry,
Yes.
that's
okay.
a language, just
That's
how
okay.
the question was worded.
All
Okay,
right.
so now I'm going to mute and you've got 2 minutes to discuss your answer.
Okay. So the Affordable Care Act, as you said, is something that may be addressed by the Supreme Court. And certainly with 20 million Americans that have access to healthcare, affordable healthcare now, that's something that I would hope would stand. And a state level, there's a House Bill number 3. And House Bill number 3 is a state-based exchange and reinsurance program, and it would make healthcare more affordable and accessible for Pennsylvanians. The bill would be available for those who lost insurance if the ACA is dismantled. And this is why we need to have the majority in the House and the Senate, because this legislation would provide things like lower premiums, lower deductibles, and lower cost in drugs. And when we talk about pre-existing conditions, you have to understand that that is extremely personal to me. I know many people and many patients that I've taken care of over the last 27 years that put off access to healthcare, put off preventative healthcare because they couldn't afford it, because of a pre-existing condition. And, many of you know that my son Jake had leukemia, and he was a little boy, and now he has a pre-existing condition, which would make it difficult for him and for a family to afford healthcare with that diagnosis. So House Bill 3 is something that's important to me, and I would definitely support.
Okay, I'm going to mute Bridget. I'm going to ask James to unmute. And James, I'm going to ask you the same 3 questions for yes or no, and then you can have 2 minutes to discuss your answer. So the first is, would you support the continuation of the extended eligibility for Medicaid, which provided health coverage to many Pennsylvanians?
On principle, yes. Obviously, I need to see the specifics of the legislation as it came through.
Would you support continuation of children being eligible to remain on their parents' health insurance until the age of 26? Yes or no?
Again, I like that concept on principle, but I would have to see the specifics. And the
And
last one, absolutely, yeah, pre-existing condition. I was just as confused as Bridget was on the way that was worked. I was
sorry.
trying to figure out, am I for or against the ban? So yes, Bridget, I know she said that she is, that any legislation that comes up, we have got to make sure that we protect pre-existing conditions. And I agree with Bridget on that 100%. And I know at the federal level, it seems like both parties are in agreement on that idea. How they get there is going to be something, how they go about it, and very, very different. But yes, whatever we do, and I will absolutely commit to saying that I would only support a healthcare plan in which we are protecting pre-existing conditions. This is one of those topics that, to give a short, yes or no, quick answer on a bill that is obviously going to be dozens and dozens of pages long, with so many of these things, the devil is in the detail on what we're looking at. I'll sort of step back from it and just say that I think that we need to have more competition within our healthcare system. And I think we need to look at many of the regulations that we have right now and what those are doing to drive up costs. And we need to focus on that. One of the things that we've seen through the pandemic is that the governor was able to come in and to lift many of the restrictions that were in place already with what was taking place with healthcare. And you look and you say, okay, probably not every one of those needs to be lifted permanently, but it did show that there's a lot of regulations in place that can be lifted and we can continue to be safe. And so I think we need to step back now. One of the lessons, Lane, we talked earlier about the lessons learned through the pandemic in regards to mail-in ballots. And I think that if we can go back and look at the entire healthcare system and say, okay, in the midst of this, they did lift a lot of the restrictions. And so are some of those restrictions ones that can be, that they can leave those off in a more permanent fashion? And so we can do that. But bottom line, absolutely, absolutely on the pre-existing conditions, we need to protect those who have pre-existing conditions.
Okay, James, this next question goes to you first. And let's talk about education funding now. So Senate Bill 76 would abolish school property taxes and use state money generated from personal income taxes and sales taxes to fund education. So the question for you is, do you believe that a statewide system of funding education is better than the current funding system that relies primarily on property taxes set by each school district? And can the state reasonably cover the expense?
The answer is yes and yes. And so I think what we have got to do is start with the basic fundamental premise that says we are going to move away from a school property tax and into something like House Bill 76. And I know that a lot of people will get into the weeds on that bill and say, well, here's a small issue with it. And again, going back to Representative Sid Michael Scavullich, he was one of the co-sponsors of House Bill 76. And he said, and I agree with him, that there are some of the details on it that do need to be worked out. But I believe on principle, yes, it absolutely can be a much fairer funding source, and it can do what we need it to do. Now, there's two sides of this as well. We need to look at why are we spending anywhere from $17,000 to $20,000 per student per year to educate children in Pennsylvania. And I think we need to take a very serious look at that as well. But with looking at the House Bill 76, the fundamental unfairness of the way we do our taxes in Pennsylvania. There are other states around the nation that are able to fund their school systems, they're able to fund their budgets without taxing property the way that we do. So I think we have to start with a basic premise that says, yes, it's possible. We are going to make it happen. If we were starting a new state right now and we said, go out and start a new state and we're going to do so without taxing the people through the school property tax the way that we do it, it can be done. And I absolutely believe it can be done and I believe that it must be done.
Okay, thank you. James, I'll mute you, and Bridget, I'll ask you to unmute. And the question to you is, do you believe that the statewide system of funding for education is better than the current funding system? And can the state reasonably cover the expense?
Okay, I'm unmuted here.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so we have 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. One of the things that COVID-19 has brought even more light to be exposed is how incredibly underfunded our public school system is in all its inequalities. Pennsylvania students don't have access to technology, and that was a huge problem, and it's now more than ever a huge problem. We have some schools who are the sole provider when it comes to feeding our children, and it's extremely alarming. We flat out need fair funding. The reality is there's no room here for debate on that. And we have schools in Western Pennsylvania who have seen a decrease in their population for years. And because of this formula that we're using from the 1980s, those schools are receiving the same funding as a school up in Carbondale, and it's a major problem. And when you say the cost per child, as my opponent just said, like 17,000 to 20,000 per kid, that's where all these inequalities are. In Carbondale, it could be 5,300 per child. School district like Lower Merion, is the 26,000 per child. So, these are the inequalities that we need to address. In order for our schools to be effective during this pandemic, we need to trust and listen to our educators and when it comes to their needs. So we need to stop giving these unfunded mandates and telling our schools what to do, and without providing them with the sources to do so. There's a whole different topic that you touched here, and that was House Bill 76 and the property tax reform. I do believe that I do not believe in House Bill 76. I don't support it. It's been around a long time. It's been around, I think it's been around almost 20 years. It was at one point in a Republican held House. We had a Republican Senate, and we even had a Republican governor, and it didn't change. The bill didn't get through. And I think that's because, you can't have good policy through poor legislation. So we do need property tax relief, 100%. I know people worry about their taxes, and certainly those living on fixed incomes.
Thank you.
So two different topics.
All right, thank you. I'm going to mute you, and I'm going to ask James to unmute. Right. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep James muted, and Bridget, I apologize. I am asking you to unmute because the next question goes to you. So this question pertains to the minimum wage. So there are 29 states with a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum of $7.25. Pennsylvania is the only mid-Atlantic state that has not raised the $7.25 hourly minimum wage since its adoption in 2009. Do you feel the Pennsylvania minimum wage should be increased? If not, then why not? And if yes, by how much and on what timeline?
Okay. So minimum wage, when you talk about $7.25 an hour, it's been in place since 2009. And I just think it's too low. And I do believe increasing it. I do believe in increasing it. So an immediate jump to the $15 an hour is something I don't think is feasible at this moment. But I do believe an acceptable compromise is an immediate raise to $11 an hour. Look at all of our neighboring states, including West Virginia. They were able to find a way to raise their minimum wage. And I think we can do so here in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to mute Bridget and ask James to unmute. James, the question goes to you. Should the minimum wage be increased? If not, then why not? And if yes, by how much and on what timeline?
I think we are looking at this entirely backwards. And I think there would be a much better way for us to look at the minimum wage. First of all, the intent of the minimum wage is not for the family of four to be living on for the rest of their lives. It's for someone like my daughter, who just came back. She spent the last year and a half down in Honduras. Right after she graduated from high school, she went down there. She's coming back. She needs to get her foot in the door somewhere, and she needs to be able to start off. And I'm hoping that businesses will give her a shot at doing that. And so but I don't want her working for minimum wage for the rest of her life and supporting a family one day on minimum wage. And so the point of having a minimum wage is not for families to be living on that for the rest of their lives. What I would like us to look at doing, and I've not heard anybody else talking about this. I was just talking with the president of a bank recently, and I told him my idea. I don't see why we can't look at incentivizing higher minimum wage rather than mandating it. I always have trouble when the government is coming in and dictating to two private individuals to say, okay, if the first person and the second person both agree that they will perform a certain service for a certain work that they're doing, to have the government come in and say, well, no, we don't think that's enough for you to pay that person. I would rather have us incentivize. And so what I would look at doing is to have the government say, okay, here's kind of our goal for what we would like to see wages paid. And so we would like to see a certain amount paid. Above that, for every dollar that you go higher than that, we'll provide you a little bit of tax incentive to raise the minimum wage. So it's not the government coming in and mandating that you need to increase your wages, but rather incentivizing by saying, okay, for every dollar you go above a certain amount, we will give you some tax breaks. So I would much rather see the government incentivizing higher wages rather than dictating and mandating higher wages.
Okay, thank you. So James, this next question will go to you first. So let's talk about something else that's in the news, and that's policing. Governor Tom Wolf will appoint a watchdog and create a commission to investigate alleged misconduct by the Pennsylvania State Police and other law enforcement agencies under his purview. But additional reform, including changing how officers can use deadly force, improving access to body camera footage, etc., will need approval from the legislature. Legislation to create a disciplinary database and require additional training and mental health screenings for officers has been proposed, but a version of the measure has been sitting in committee without a hearing since March 2019. The question to you, do you think that there is a need for statewide reform of policing practices? And if so, what are those needs and how will you support state action to bring them about?
I think there's a need for all of us to look and say, what can we do to improve relations? I'm a little bit concerned, though, that we're taking a few examples of what are clearly exceptions rather than the rule, and that we're using those to make it seem like there's a huge percentage of our police officers who are inherently racist or inherently biased, or that there's this huge underlying issue out there with our policemen and policewomen not being good, honest individuals. And I get nervous when I begin seeing us make them into almost the rule rather than the exception. We don't do this in any other industry. You could go through and you can find examples of teachers who have been, the bad apples out of the teachers. You can find nurses, you can find military, every occupation will have bad individuals in it. And we've seen that. I mean, what happened with George Floyd, by every stretch of the imagination, was just straight up murder. And I think all of us who either saw that video or saw the clips of it would agree that there were problems there. But yes, things that we can do like body cameras, more training. I want us to be able to do that, but I don't want us to make it sound like that's something that needs to be happening, or that these reforms are something that need to be happening with the police because there's an overall big picture problem with the police. They are by far and away good individuals. And I think that if we're at the point where we're trying to say, okay, there's this big issue with our police departments, that's really unfair to them, because by and large, the vast majority of them are very, very good, honorable individuals.
Okay, thank you. Then James, I'm going to mute you, and Bridget, I'll ask you to unmute. And the question will go to you. Do you think there's a need for a statewide reform of policing practices? And if so, what are those needs and how will you support state action to bring them about?
So, okay, I do think that there's a lot of attention right now in our country on police departments, and certainly with racism. And I want to make sure people understand that I believe that the Black Lives Matter, and I fully support our local police. And I don't think the two of them should be mutually exclusive. And I support peaceful protests, and I do not support any kind of violence. And I believe that any kind of looting and rioting should be penalized immediately. I do not support defunding our police. My father-in-law is a retired police state trooper, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for our men and women in law enforcement. There's no police officer out there that would support or advocate kneeling on someone's neck like they did in the George Floyd murder for 8 minutes, or shooting somebody in the back 7 times. So there's a need for, obviously in further training in all professions. So what I would do is I would support and have voted unanimously in the House on certain police reforms, like legislation to help prevent lethal use of force by police, reforming law enforcement and hiring process, placing a greater emphasis on mental health and screenings for our officers, especially those that suffer from PTSD. But I truly believe if we want to see true reform, then we're actually going to need to increase the funding to our police, especially if we want trained caseworkers, mental health professionals working with our police force at the scene of the call. So we need to increase their funding so they have the support they need to get the job done efficiently. But I also want to make sure that we have the conversation with our communities and addressing racism, not only just when it comes to certain instances involving police, but rather dive deeper into the conversation. And I think that's something that we can do in educating our children in just systemic racism.
Okay, thank you. Bridget, this next question is going to go to you first. And sticking with the law and order theme, we're going to talk about gun control. Pennsylvania has state preemption for regulation of the ownership, possession, transfer, or transportation of firearms, ammunition, or ammunition components, which means that only state laws, not local laws, can regulate those matters. This preemption rule limits the ability of cities to enact ordinances to limit the proliferation of guns, such as mandating the reporting of lost or stolen firearms and limits on the possession or transfer of military-style assault weapons. Legislation has been promoted in the past that would strike the prohibition on municipal gun regulations from state law. The question to you, do you favor allowing some local control on guns? If not, are you in favor of any specific statewide controls?
So gun violence is a real issue in our communities and our country. There's a lot we can do to protect both the Second Amendment and make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. So like you said, I do support by mandating the lost and stolen and reporting stolen guns and having stricter background checks. I'm in full support of the Second Amendment. And my belief is kind of simple on this one. We've got to limit access to firearms when you are convicted of a domestic violence, deemed severely mental ill. And if you are on a no-fly or a list or suspected of terrorism. I think we need to address also the fact that we have a really high percentage of gun suicide, and we have to invest in our mental health system. And those are things we can do at the state level.
Okay, thank you. And once again, I'll ask James to unmute. And the question goes to you. Do you favor allowing some local control on guns? And if not, are you in favor of any specific statewide controls? James, I'm sorry, you're still muted.
Okay.
Now you're good.
It almost feels like when I hit the unmute, when you mute Bridget, maybe it undoes mine, or I'm not sure. Either way, this is our first time getting through this. It's craziness of a Zoom debate here. So when you say local controls, typically what people mean by that is restrictions that are put in place. We have more than enough laws on the books right now. My take with guns has always been that anything that a drug dealer, a gang member, and a leader of organized crime can obtain illegally law-abiding citizens should be able to have that same weapon legally. And having run a lot of mission trips down into Central and South America, I've seen firsthand what happens when you take guns away from law-abiding citizens, or when you even begin to put restrictions on law-abiding citizens. Because what happens, and if you go into San Juan, Honduras, or you go to any of those Central American countries, in many of them, you have situations where the bad guys end up with all the guns and with the access to the internet. And so whenever I hear people talk about, we're going to put this kind of restriction on, or we're going to limit this type of gun, or we're going to put these kind of restrictions, all that happens when you do that is you're taking guns away from, or you're taking certain type of weapons or certain type of ammunition away from the law-abiding citizens, because your criminals are not going to listen and follow these rules that they put in place. And so I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I am endorsed by the National Rifle Association, Gun Owners America, Firearm Owners Against Crime. I know Sid was as well. And it's protected by the Constitution. And as such, the Pennsylvania State Constitution is actually stronger, I think, in many ways than the federal Constitution. And I will always protect the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I will always protect gun owners' rights to keep and bear arms.
Okay, James, this next question goes to you first, and we're going to move on to the environment now. So let's talk about fracking. Pennsylvania may be the only leading gas producing state that does not impose taxes or a severance fee on the amount of gas extracted by fracking and sold on the world market. Fracking companies may pay an impact fee, which is based on the number of wells, but not on the volume of the natural resource they take. A severance tax, which is based on the amount of resources taken, is what all other states impose on such companies. The question to you, would you support imposing reasonable fees on fracking companies in recognition of what they're taking from the natural resources and their effect on our roads, bridges, and streams?
I gotta say, your question sort of sounds like the talking points of the Democrat Party when you talk about the reasonable, that it's a reasonable, and how all the other states do. And I understand that, I appreciate that, but I will just kind of point that out there, that those sounded like all the talking points of the Democrats. So I do not support the tax there. That Pennsylvania already has the impact fee that is in place. I do not support a severance tax. I think when we look at this, the benefits to what we are doing right now with Pennsylvania and our fracking is it's not only producing jobs here in northeastern Pennsylvania, it's not only producing energy for us, but we are becoming a net exporter of energy around the world right now. And when you look, even to take it as big as what's happening around the world right now, many of the times when we get into different wars around the world, when you go back to the Gulf War, when you look at what happened with Iraq, when you look at, many of those have their root in energy and oil and energy. I think that for the good of our nation, the more that we can do to make us energy independent, the more that we can do to help promote this. This is a good thing that is happening. It is providing jobs, it is providing energy. Obviously, we need to absolutely make sure that it is being done in a safe way. But the governor has proposed this Restore Pennsylvania, which is just adding more taxes onto this industry. The problem with Pennsylvania right now and our budget and our roads and the infrastructure is not that we tax people too little. It is that we spend too much. And this whole idea that, well, we're just going to throw another tax on another industry and that's going to solve all of our problems, I'm opposed to that. And I don't think that we need to be looking at taxing these industries more. You're right. Pennsylvania has the impact fee, and that was set up the way that it was set up. And it's different from other states. I get that. But you don't want to come in and say, okay, we're going to have the impact fee, but now we're going to add this other tax in addition. Pennsylvania is unique in the way that we tax, and there's no need for us to go throwing another tax on this industry, which is providing so many jobs and such good energy for us here in America.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to mute James, and I'm going to ask Bridget to unmute. And Bridget, the question goes to you. Would you support imposing reasonable fees on fracking companies in recognition of their depletion of natural resources and their effect on our roads, bridges, and streams?
So when it comes to natural gas, I do support putting a severance on Marcellus Shale, the natural gas industry we have here, for a couple reasons. I want to get Pennsylvania in line with the other states that do produce gas production. I know we have an impact fee here in Pennsylvania, but when you do mathematically and you compare to the tax that the gas industry has in other states, it's not in line. I mean, it's comparable, but not, I mean, we have no tax on our natural gas. So I do think that some sort of a tax on our natural gas severance would secure revenue to fund our public education, lessen the burden of some of our taxpayers, and providing tax relief. So I do support that. And you know, when we talk about, you know, the natural gas industry, we have to remember to our environmental, you know, concerns here in Pennsylvania. We've seen the impact that it can come about. We have climate change here in our very own communities. The problem we're facing right now is that people sometimes, you know, can deny that there is climate change. And I think we have to remember that we have to make that one of our big concerns. I support Pennsylvania being in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is not only reduces climate change and carbon pollution from power plants and spur investments in energy efficiency and clean energy, and that also will create jobs. So you know, I think that we also have to remember that we've got to adequately fund the Department of Environmental Protection. It's been underfunded for the last 10 years, and we have to remember that this department will make sure that we are doing everything correctly to take care of Pennsylvania's environment.
Okay, thank you. Bridget, this question is going to go to you next or first. And I have to say, unfortunately, it's the last of the questions that we have time for today, although I probably have about another hour's worth of questions for you. So this will be the last one before we move into closing statements. And you mentioned climate change, and this is a climate change question. So in 2018, more than $63 million in public infrastructure damage from flooding was not reimbursable through federal disaster programs. And that means that state and local taxpayers bore the full burden of picking up the tab. And Pennsylvania is getting wetter. The facts are that the 48 months between June 2015 and June 2019 were the wettest in state history, and the 5 warmest summers have been the past 5 summers. So questions for you. Do you agree or disagree with the broad views of climate science? And what should Pennsylvania be doing to prepare to meet and recover from future weather-related disasters?
So, yeah, I mean, yes, I do agree with that there are environmental concerns. Most and foremost, we've got to make sure we fund the Department of Environmental Protections. When you talk about that we're getting wetter and the rain, that is part of, I believe, part of climate change. And I think that maybe, you know, we need to address the fact that when it comes to stormwater management, this is, you know, it's a requirement of the Federal Clean Water Act. It's a federal unfunded mandate. So my initial answer will always be to get more federal funding for it. And that's why I'm grateful that we have people like Congressman Cartwright, who was able to secure millions of dollars of funding for something like stormwater management. I believe we need to look at it in a regional way, because stormwater doesn't always pay attention to municipalities and legislative boundaries, and we still need funding in the cheapest way possible to make sure that we comply with federal laws. I know I've got 18 boroughs and townships and municipalities that we cannot put that tax on. They wouldn't be able to afford it. So I'm not saying that a regional authority will not come with some potential complications, but I think we need to listen to the voices of the townships, the boroughs, and the municipalities when we make this decision. I also do not want to forget that this all stems from the critical environmental concerns. You know, our state is being told to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus that flows into the Chesapeake Bay for a reason, because we need to protect our waters. And I sometimes think that that gets lost in the discussion.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Bridget, I'm going to mute you. James, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you are unmuted now. So the question goes to you. Do you agree or disagree with the broad views of climate science? And what should Pennsylvania be doing to prepare to meet and recover from future weather-related disasters?
I know your question didn't really have to do with the so-called the rain tax that a lot of people talk about. And maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Bridget, it sounded like you were saying that you support the whole idea of the regional municipal office there is essentially what is referred to as a rain tax. Maybe I was not hearing you correctly, but it sounds like that you do support that whole concept. If you want to give a head shake, yes or no, maybe. So I think the question we have to ask is whether or not the climate is changing. I mean, certainly the climate is changing. Is the climate changing because of what humans are doing? Is the climate changing because it's just sort of in a cycle where it's always changing, or is it a combination of both? We certainly need to be doing whatever we can be doing to help protect the environment in anything that we're doing. But when we look at the whole idea of what we can be doing to protect the environment, I think that we need to just step back and say, how much of this is happening because we're simply in cycles? I mean, you can look and say, yeah, the last 5 years have been some of the wettest, some of the worst flood that I think probably the worst flood our region has ever had that on record was 50 years ago in 1972. And so, you know, to make sure that we're doing with everything, we need to make sure that we're doing it with the proper balance that we have, that we're looking at, and we're not just jumping in and throwing more money at the issues because, you know, we can always talk about, okay, I heard Bridget say that our education is underfunded, the DEP is underfunded, that we need to be taxing more Marcellus shale. And so, you know, we can tax and spend and tax and spend and tax and spend all day long. But at some point we need to look and say, some of these organizations, I think we need to step back and see where where is their waste that is taking place within some of this stuff. So yeah, anything that we can do. I mean, you know, I mentioned before, I see I'm red. Okay, never mind. So yes, anything we can do to protect our environment, I will certainly make sure we're doing so.
Okay, thank you. So that concludes the questioning for today. We are allowing 2 minutes for each of our candidates to give their closing statement. We did draw a name before the start of the debate, and James, you have the first 2 minutes to give your closing statement.
So a lot of times when I'm telling people about my background, I focus on the military side of that, and you can go to the website and you can pull that up if you're really interested in hearing sort of my story from the military side. But somebody asked me a couple of months ago what I thought was the best preparation to become a public servant. And they actually used the term public servant when they asked me. So obviously my first initial response was I served in the military, served in Iraq, served in the Army, Walter Reed, Arlington, and so forth. And then I was thinking a little bit after that, I thought, well, okay, that certainly is a good preparation for public service. But I also thought about the ministry that over the past 6, almost 7 years now that my wife and I have been doing, where we take high school students from northeastern Pennsylvania and we go down into, it's been Honduras for the past few years, and we serve at a school for orphan and at-risk children. My daughter, I said, lived down there for the past 1.5 years. We set up a 1-year internship for students to go down and live down there. We go back and forth before COVID, probably 2 or 3 times a year. We spend Thanksgiving down there. And so I thought, well, maybe that's the better example of the preparation, because you're actually serving and you're teaching local high school students how to serve others. However, the answer that I gave actually took place here in the room where I am right now. This is an office building, but back in the late 1980s, 1990, the building where I'm sitting here, where actually my office is, was a home for adults and children with severe mental disabilities. I'm in Scott Township right now. It's a place called Still Meadows. And when I was in college, I worked here for my $5 an hour job. I worked up here at Still Meadows as a direct care worker for the mentally challenged children and adults with intellectual disabilities. But then I also started a a program where we bring 20 to 30 college students up here every week. And, you know, some of the kids up here had very severe challenges that they were working through. They couldn't feed themselves. Many of them were still in diapers. I mean, you're dealing with all levels of intellectual struggles that they had. And when I look back now on what it means to be a public servant, I see a lot of people in Harrisburg or DC who are not true public servants. And my goal is to be a true servant to the people.
Thank you very much. Bridget, I'll ask you to unmute, please.
Okay.
And you've got 2 minutes for your closing statement.
Okay. And thank you again to the League of Women Voters. And Mr. May, I wanted to say it was nice to meet you virtually for this debate. And also thank you very much for your service. We really appreciate it. I was sworn into office 17 months ago. And after working in the healthcare sector for 27 years, I can tell you it's been a very educational experience. Never could I have imagined how much I was going to have to rely on my nursing background to make some of the most difficult decisions in the legislature. I entered this arena with the same intentions I had entered when I went into nursing, and that was to help people. I never really understood politics, and to be honest, I don't have any intentions of learning it. I just want to do good work, and that may not make me the best campaigner, but I'm hoping it makes me a more effective legislator. I'm very proud of the accomplishments that I have achieved in such a short period of time. I was able to bring back $8.9 million to my district in less than one term. My district office is staffed with amazing people, and they were able to provide 20,000 constituent services to our residents. I've introduced 12 pieces of legislation that tackle a whole range of issues. And during this global pandemic, I was able to introduce and unanimously pass legislation in a Republican-held House and a Senate committee to provide PPE to our factory workers and food processing workers. And I was able to do so because as a nurse and a mother of 4, when I see a problem, I look for solution, not blame. And I was able to work across the aisle with my Republican colleagues and found that solution. And I think that's a key quality in leadership and listening and working with others. So now more than ever in this public healthcare crisis, we need a leader that is steady on her feet and will follow the science and facts, someone who will not incite any fear or anger and not create any havoc during an already chaotic environment, and to gain any political relevance. And I want to protect the most vulnerable population. Yeah, I want to fight for our schools, our students, the teachers, and I need to fight for real relief for that crippling tax burden that are upon so many of our residents. We need to ensure that we have affordable access to healthcare, and most importantly, protect those with the pre-existing conditions. And I want to continue all this progress that I've made in the 114th district, and that's why I'm really excited to humbly ask for people to re-elect me as their state representative on November 3rd.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of our candidates today, Bridget Malloy Kosierowski and James May. First, thank you for your service and your willingness to throw your hat in the ring. We appreciate that. I also want to be sure that that everyone understands that the League of Women Voters is a volunteer organization. We are a membership organization, so we choose to be a member of the League, but we are nonpartisan. We are neither Democratic nor Republican. We do not support any candidates for public office. We do take positions on issues, but overall, we do not support any candidates or any platform overall. So I want to be clear on that. I would like to thank our partners, the University of Scranton Political Science Department, ECTV, all of my League members who work so hard on all of the questions. I really appreciate that. And our timer and our president for being here today. Ann Domsky is our timer, and Diana Dakey, our president. And I would also really like to thank Toyota of Scranton for their financial support of the work of the League. We really, truly appreciate that. I'd like to close with my all-time favorite quote: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." That's attributed to Margaret Mead. And please remember that your vote counts on November 3rd. Thank you so much for joining us today.